Welcome to anyone who's joining the conference for the first time. My name's Lisa Travnik. I'm Chief Growth Officer here at Sourcemap. We're so excited to have you. We'll get started here in a second with our speakers here, but just as a note, if you have any questions during the session, there is a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. I'll be taking a look at those and incorporating those into my questions throughout this fireside chat. The name of this session is Tracing and Limiting Restricted Goods in the Supply Chain. Today, we're pleased to have Ethan Woolley, Director at Kharon, as well as Leonardo Bonanni, CEO and founder of Sourcemap. I can let you two introduce yourselves really quickly, and then we can get started. Ethan, you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. Well, thanks, Leo and Lisa, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Lisa said, my name is Ethan Woolley. I work with all of Kharon's clients in a couple of key industries like retail and apparel, automotive, chemicals, manufacturing, and retail. And largely that's mostly UFLPA and forced labor related. It's not the only thing Kharon does, but that tends to be a very large chunk of my day. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all.
Thanks, Ethan. And I'm Leo. I'm the founder at Sourcemap, and we work closely with Kharon as part of helping our customers map their supply chains to comply with a number of regulations, including all of the U.S. forced labor bans. And our job is to identify all the sub-suppliers, get the evidence that they're actually the sub-suppliers. But with Kharon, we have an unparalleled partner in validating that the companies that our customers are doing business with are above board, and even that the companies that they are affiliated with are compliant with the laws. So we work on these important tasks together, mostly around these U.S. regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll jump right in here because I think everyone on the call knows that this has been a record year. Every year it gets a little bit tougher, but a record year for forced labor enforcement in the US, and really no signs that those detentions are slowing down. So as we've said, both Sourcemap and Kharon support companies, particularly with forced labor due diligence and supply chain transparency. So can you both tell us a little bit more, and Ethan, I'll have you go first, about how your companies approach this issue, how your approach has evolved over the years, maybe some things that you've been looking at a little closer this year with kind of the escalations that we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Kharon is a research and data analytics firm. We're not a supply chain mapping platform. We're not talking to your suppliers. We're not using our clients' data for anything. What our job is to identify in the context of UFLPA, identify the companies in China that present or create UFLPA based on something that they've done. So that means using guidance like initially the Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory, which dates back to 2020. It's been updated a few times. The UFLPA strategy updates that are published on an annual basis per the law's requirement. Other operational guidance from DHS and CBP. We look for the red flags that the U.S. government has identified as being indicators of Uyghur forced labor in Xinjiang and outside of Xinjiang. The issue of things like labor transfers really make the issue of UFLPA broader than just Xinjiang geographically, because those labor transfers go all over the country. And we've seen a lot of companies be added to the entity list outside of Xinjiang because DHS or other parts of the US government has evidence that they've received labor transfers or participated in these activities that expand beyond the boundaries of Xinjiang. So it's our job, using all publicly available sources, analysts who speak 20 plus languages, to identify those companies before they've been listed. So we're not just waiting for a company to be added to the entity list and then investigating it. We're actually out ahead of it. And with a few exceptions, every company added to the entity list in the last 2 years has already been in our data, flagged for risk based on the activities they've been involved in. And that information has been available to our joint with Sourcemap, that if one of those suppliers that we've identified has risk, is a sub-tier, like a tier 3, tier 4 supplier somewhere in China or in a third country, that they have exposure back in some way. So that's the role that we play. We're not talking to your suppliers, and we're not taking any of our clients' data. We're just doing the research and making it available through Sourcemap.
Perfect segue. So that is what we do. We
Exactly.
are we're in we're in the job of supply chain management software for the indirect supply chain. So we have to, we have the job of identifying who your suppliers are, and that is a proprietary database that each of our customers builds of their own indirect supply chain. So they ask their suppliers who they buy from. The those suppliers get invited, they get asked the same thing. So through this cascading, we end up building a pretty giant network of all of the tier two, tier three, tier four suppliers our customers didn't know they had. And part of that is we do have a team that reaches out to them, that introduces them to the platform, that explains the data we need, that the regulations that they're following, and we do that uniformly. So we're not targeting any specific industry, any specific materials, any specific part of the world. SourceMap is really mapping the entire supply chain. I mean, we've seen that, whatever the end outcome of these laws, mapping and tracing the supply chain is essential because you might think you're buying something from someone somewhere, and it's only once you've mapped their suppliers that you discover the true source. And so we've seen, the vast majority of detentions by CBP for forced labor actually coming from Malaysia, coming from Vietnam. So goods make their way around the world and enter markets through a lot of third countries, a lot of third actors, a lot of distributors. And whether our customers are doing it purely for forced labor compliance or also because they have issues around um, resilience, making sure the supply chain is authentic. No matter what the need is, you need to first ask your suppliers where they buy from, and then you need to verify that they actually buy from those suppliers by getting additional evidence. And so that's what we call traceability, and that means compiling receipts and contracts and bills of lading and payment stubs, essentially validating that the links in the supply chain are what they're supposed to be. The combination of the two, from our point of view, is really the best in class defense in the event that Customs and Border Protection has questions about a shipment, to say, no, I know where all the parts of this shipment came from, and these are all the vendors, and I have their contact info, and these are all the documents I have to back it up. And one of the best things we can do with that supply chain map is run it against a watch list. Of course, we know about the entities list that Ethan mentioned, but we also want to have that privileged data. Our job is also to keep our customers months, if not years ahead of enforcement, and able to adjust their sourcing practices, to be the best given the new laws. And so we work with Kharon on that front.
Awesome. So Ethan, you kind of teed this up here too. You all at Kharon are definitely watching the trends. You've mentioned how you'll have entities in your list, up to a year or even longer before it really ends up on a sanctions list. So a question we get a lot from our customers in particular is where is this all going? What's the next evolution of this, both in terms of enforcement and trends and focus areas? So from your seat, how do you see the forced labor enforcement evolving, as we head into 2025, not just in the US, but, we're starting to see this pick up even more globally with a number of different laws. And, are there any trends in particular that Kharon has been seeing in its research that we should all be aware of?
Yeah, so I mean, a few thoughts just off that. I mean, based on we'll talk sort of UFLPA at first, then I'll talk about some of the other laws around the world that are either now in force or coming soon. So for the context of UFLPA and the publicly available data from CBP on that dashboard that they created about a year ago, the U.S. government's fiscal year runs through the end of September. So just last week, the data was updated. We now have full enforcement data for the US government's 2024 fiscal year. And the total amount of enforcement and detentions in dollar value was up last year, or 2024, to about $1.74 billion detained, as opposed to about 1.42 billion in fiscal year 2023 for the government, again, ending end of September. So we've seen that the amount of detentions and a dollar value percentage has increased, and we see no evidence of that changing. The prioritized sectors for enforcement also expanded this summer for the first time since the law took effect 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. So initially, cotton, polysilicon, and tomatoes were prioritized. That was written into the law, and over the summer, aluminum, seafood, and polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, were added as well as new prioritized sectors. Now, one thing to note is that prior to those three new sectors being added, companies in those sectors had already been added to the entity list. So back in June, DHS added a seafood manufacturer and processor. And then 3 months later, 2 months later, formally prioritized seafood in the strategy update. Same thing with aluminum and with PVC. Companies in those sectors had been listed, individual companies, before the sector itself was prioritized. Now, as far as the entity list is concerned, we announced this about 2 months ago. Kharon was awarded a contract with the UFLPA entity list office at DHS. We were awarded a contract about a year ago with CBP for enforcement of the law. And there's a bit of a division of labor between the entity list office, which is managing the entity list within DHS and the other FLEDF agencies, and then CBP, which is obviously on the front lines of enforcement. So we're now working with both of those different sides of the law. As far as other laws are concerned, we're about a year into Canada's law, Bill S-211, the very long title now, but which is called the Supply Chain Act, Canada's forced labor law. There's been some talk about that law, about a reverse onus provision being applied. That's similar to the rebuttable presumption that's in the UFLPA, which I think really gives the UFLPA teeth and is a sort of a watershed as far as human rights law learned. Reverse onus is not exactly the same thing, but it's similar. The Canadian law was criticized before it took effect by some for not having that reverse onus or assumption of forced labor for certain goods or certain regions. Just about a week ago, the Canadian government opened up public consultations about possibly adding a reverse onus to certain goods. Actually, next week, Kharon will be having an event with the Canadian MP who sponsored the law in the House of Commons, talking about the first year of enforcement. And he was recently on record saying he intends to table legislation about adding a reverse onus provision for certain regions of the world. And Xinjiang is mentioned as one of those. And obviously, we have laws coming down the pipe in Europe as well. But I really think, we've also seen legislators in the US publicly apply pressure to lawmakers in Canada and Mexico to uphold the anti-forced labor provisions in the USMCA or NAFTA 2.0 agreement that all three countries signed. And there seems to be some movement on that from, at least in Canada, that those calls from US lawmakers that were responsible for UFLPA are being heeded. So a lot going on.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on. Are there any predictions, either from Kharon or personally, about what industries will pop up next? I know we get that question a lot.
No official predictions from Kharon. I mean, from my perspective, we don't take Kharon doesn't take a specific industry approach, so we weren't waiting until aluminum was prioritized to look into aluminum. We weren't waiting until there's a lot of press about the automotive industry about a year ago with UFLPA. We were way ahead of that and focusing on that industry and on the components of that industry that are high risk long before that happened. So Kharon, we don't take a industry or commodity based approach. We're looking for all the risk.
Great. Do you want to walk us through a little bit about how Kharon's Clearview works? I think that would be of interest as well. Just how exactly do you guys get and share this information? I think that's the first step while clients are starting to map their supply chains, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we work, like I said, we're conducting investigations and we use all publicly available information. So we're not limiting ourselves to just corporate records or just media reporting or trade data, which can be tricky within China. But there is information within China available, but it's our analysts' jobs who speak these languages. So I came to Kharon to be a Russian analyst at first, so I'm not a Chinese speaker, but our Chinese speaking analysts, it's their jobs to understand what's happening within China and what information is available. All of our information goes through multiple rounds of human review and analysis before it gets published to our system and to our clients. And so we're not just bulk scraping information and dumping it into our client's lap to try to sift through and make sense of. You're going to see always a source, citation for our data, notes from our analysts where relevant. But anytime a supplier that is flagged by Sourcemap for being in our data, there's going to be a URL that connects users to this system, and I'll share my screen right now. So what you're seeing, this is what we call clear view. This is kind of like your home base for Kharon's data. Now, this exact example, about a few weeks ago, Kharon was quoted in a Nikkei Asia article talking about pharmaceutical precursors linked back to Xinjiang for companies that had received USDA and the Japanese versions or FDA approval for pharmaceutical companies. So these were some of the entities mentioned in that article, just for context here. But when you're looking through this system, the yellow circles represent starting points for Kharon's research. So we begin our investigations with parties that present risk. Now, nothing on the screen here is on the entity list per se, but if you hover over, you see this company, which is mentioned in that article. It's based in Xinjiang. You can see all the information on the company here, the name in Chinese, the names, aliases, former aliases as well, so formerly known as. We would track those old names, where it's located, its identification numbers, so social credit code in China, a stock exchange code if that's relevant. And all these are fields we provide in the data to Sourcemap to screen against. So matches for multiple languages, addresses, old names, all those kinds of things. Now, this company they manufacture pharmaceutical precursors. They're in Xinjiang. They're based at this economic development zone, and they engaged in transfers. And so you click, and you can see on the right-hand side, there's always a source for Kharon's research, and you're going to see translations of things like media articles, annual reports, securities disclosures, I won't go into the specific details of everything we use. It's available to our clients always. And everything we use is publicly available, so it's all knowable. I just won't go into a ton of detail here, but when you click on that relationship, you're always going to see exactly what source we used and when, the dates of those sources, et cetera. And then, the trade relationships here as well. So if, for example, Shanghai Shindek Pharmaceutical was a tier 3 supplier of yours in Sourcemap, you would get the alert that this company's a match for Kharon's data. Here's the URL, and it would open this system and show you, we didn't start here. We started over here and got to that company from a few different directions, all these vendor relationships you can see.
And one of the things I really appreciate the most about Kharon's way of working is it's very aligned with what we do. So we're building an evidence trail, we're building an audit trail from data that was attested to by suppliers. So there's no inferring, there's no AI scraping, there's no hallucinations. We're getting the testimony from the supply chain and the evidence to back it up. Similarly, they're doing the research, they're reading the documents, they're compiling the evidentiary support to make these arguments about these various risks and potential non-compliances. So we're looking at very concrete data that's been vetted by teams of people on all sides, and our job is to do the matching. So you saw the various names, also known as, formerly known as, different languages. Our job, obviously, is mapping. We might be finding out about a tier 3 or a tier 4 supplier from somebody in the supply chain that speaks a completely different language, right? This might be passing through a third country. So our job is to get those names in those various languages to match across all the potential names, all the potential languages, and also the locations. So we're doing a lot of geographic matching. Essentially, if somebody has a similar name in a similar location, we translate, we get that match to Kharon's database. We're immediately servicing back to our customer that URL saying, hey, this supplier appears here in Kharon. Click to find out exactly what evidence they have. And that really builds a very robust case that the responsible sourcing manager can take back to their direct supplier and say, hey, we found this in your supply chain. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what kind of a corrective action you can implement. Here's how much time you have to do it. So it's a very robust and completely evidence-based, transparent body of work, all the way from discovering your suppliers to validating whether or not they're compliant with these forced labor regulations.
That's great. And while we're sharing screen here, Ethan, you'd mentioned to me a few different case studies. I think seafood, steel. I know you're looking at pharma right now, some of the areas that are not cotton, not some of the commodities that we've been talking about for a while here. Do you mind sharing a couple of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a seafood example up here. This is probably a familiar name to a lot on the call. So this was that seafood company that was added to the entity list in June of this year. And so that's all available here. Now, we had begun researching this company a few months about before the UFLPA took effect, about a month before. So it had been in our data for that time. We see here is that it engaged in a couple of labor transfers. And again, the sourcing is all available here. Again, all available that we're relying upon. Interestingly, one of these labor transfers involved, and again, these are all companies in Eastern China and Shandong. They're not in Xinjiang. Um, One of them involved specifically, the source named this specific subsidiary. Other subsidiaries here that weren't necessarily named in those sources, but are part of the broader conglomerate. Um, these are all located at this one economic development zone. So a number of these laborers, about 2 dozen off the source, were named as going to this company, which is co-located here at this development zone in Shandong, which you can see right here. Now, there are other companies in other corporate networks, other corporations at this development zone. So there's another aquatic food group with subsidiaries located at this same development zone. Now, Kharon has no evidence that these companies were involved in these sort of labor transfers or poverty alleviation programs, but these kinds of co-locations with high-risk activities where, these industrial parks are pretty common within Xinjiang. Uh, one company at the industrial park receives a labor transfer, but there's 50 companies total at the industrial park. Other times, the labor transfer is sent to the park itself, not any one company. And so we're always looking, once we identify a company has risk, where is it located and what else is located there? We also see, and this is interesting, some might, this name is probably also familiar because of the Ocean Outlaw Project's report about this time last year. Talks about this company. Kharon does not use NGO reports as sources. We certainly read them and go through them, but we're never going to cite them. We always go to the primary source. But what's interesting here is that we have a former ownership relationship. This ownership, this divestment occurred a few months after the company was named in that NGO report. Ultimately, though, it is still owned by Shandong Meijia through this company, which it was divested to. So these kinds of subsidiaries, the high-risk locations, understanding the discrete labor transfers themselves are also something that we focus on. I can share another example here, more for automotive. So this is where there was some letters put out by the House Select Committee on the CCP earlier in the spring that mention about 53 companies or government entities in those reports. Of those 53, 50 of them were already in Kharon's data. And one of the three we didn't have actually was dissolved back in 2018, which is partially why we didn't have it. But this company was not mentioned in that report. They make precursors for a graphite specifically for batteries, primarily for EVs, but also for consumer electronics. What we had identified based on an article in Chinese from XPCC, which is sanctioned by the Treasury Department, very heavily involved in forced labor in Xinjiang. An official article they published last year talked about how this company, Xinjiang Tianhengji Technology, had established a long-term strategic partnership with a couple of companies, one of them being Kaijin New Energy, which you see right here, and other domestic lithium battery anode material production and sales leaders, all taken directly from that source. Well, this company, Kaijin New Energy, one, they're direct, or at least they claim in their securities disclosures, their annual reports, other sourcing we've looked at, to be suppliers to major automotive OEMs, name brands that everyone would know in the West. They're also suppliers to a number of major battery manufacturers, intermediate suppliers in the EV space, again, also consumer electronics batteries. This company, Tianhengji, is located at this industrial park, which is located within a development zone. Development zone has an industrial park within it. At that industrial park is where this company is located. That development zone itself receive labor transfers organized by XPCC, according to state Xinjiang media. It's also hosts a subsidiary of XPCC. So XPCC is obviously sanctioned by the Treasury Department. One of its subsidiaries is sanctioned by the UK, EU, and Canada. It's on the UFLPA entity list and another number of other lists as well. Uh, Massive corporate network. We've built that out years ago and we've been maintaining it to see what subsidiaries and what operating units exist and where they're located. And oftentimes you see an affiliate or a business unit located at these high risk locations like a development zone or an industrial park. And in this case here, this unit 3 degrees down is at that development zone that ultimately hosts Tianhengji and received this labor transfer. And
Let
again, for
me
everything you see here, the sourcing is all available to our users.
let me dig in a little bit if you'll indulge. So we have had a couple of incidents of suppliers in our customers' supply chains getting flagged by one system or another. And usually the actual supply chain is pretty nuanced in the sense that I think in one case they had identified a bad actor, as it were, in the supply chain. Our customer had, and they had made sure that actor was no longer in the supply chain. But in some of the databases, this affiliation had sort of persisted over time. Is there some sort of a refreshing of this data that happens on a regular basis that could help companies sort of know whether they're exposed, as of today or as of an order that might be was placed a year ago or 2 years ago?
Yeah, it's certainly up to our clients to make their own determination based on their risk appetite. What we're doing is showing you, who creates UFLPA risk and then who has exposure to them. And certain things like the dates of shipments, the dates of the source that we're using, our clients will use to make their own determinations and also empower them to ask questions. So, instead of saying, hey, we see from publicly available information that you bought from this company. Are you still buying from them? You could ask instead, have you ever bought from this company? Asking a question you already kind of know the answer to, and the response you get back, and have that in your back pocket. Now you'll see things like labor transfers that we have in our data that predate 2020 that are a little older. That's intentional. We see companies being added to the entity list that engaged in labor transfers years ago. So just to switch here for a second to the final case study, uh, very public in January, February of this year, a large automotive company sort of self-declared that a tier 3 supplier was on the entity list. This was the company that was added to the list in December, Sichuan Jingwei Da, that caused that. It wasn't exactly a detention because it was a voluntary self-disclosure. Now, this company had been in our data for about a year and a half before it was listed. Well, it was identified in Chinese media as being involved in labor transfers involving thousands of people. And this was a labor transfers that occurred 7 years ago. And so they were added to the list at the end of 2023. So we intentionally go back that far for these kinds of activities, given the risk. For general kinds of like trade relationships, purchases, we're not going that far back. And we are maintaining things, certain sources like securities disclosures or annual reports, they're kind of snapshots in time. They won't always be, up to date every single day. They're published once a year sometimes. Semi-annual reports are helpful as well. A media article or a press release, that's a discrete event. And that's relevant to take into account when making a decision and can help inform some of the questions you ask once you find risk. Because very rarely is, the response to immediately dissociate once you find any sort of connection to risk. Almost always questions are asked and a decision has to be made, but you got to know which questions to ask and make sure it's an informed decision.
Yeah, a lot of other cases we've experienced have to do with the specific products or materials that are exchanged between two entities. So these might be very large industrial players.
Yep.
The onus is on really measuring what's in that container, what's in those products, not all the products that have ever flowed through that supply chain. And so a lot of times we're also looking very fine grained at which materials are in the bill of materials. Are those materials actually something that could have been bought from the bad actors, or is the supply chain clean by virtue of what products we're actually tracing? But I imagine at that point that level of data of what's actually being transacted between two actors is outside of what's in the public record.
It depends on the source. So sometimes we have very specific information, specific product names. Sometimes HS codes are available if it's international trade. Other times, one company might say on its website, "These are our partners," and they have a list of logos of their partners, and there's no
Mhm.
information on the relationships beyond that. But it's publicly available, and now to ask those questions. The other thing here is, you might have maybe your tier three supplier is sourcing from a company that received a labor transfer in the past, but they're not sourcing it for your products, and you can verify that through Sourcemap. You at least now know they still have that exposure, and so possibly be prepared to respond to a detention because this is all publicly available information, and the fact that your tier three does have exposure to risk, even though it's not relevant for your products, may be a question you'll need to answer at some point, and you can be prepared for that.
This is great. Thanks, Ethan. Kind of one more prediction question is you mentioned how the UFLPA is a watershed, really, which is, I think, a great way to describe it. We've been talking a lot on our side about the EU forced labor law coming down the pike and what that's going to look like. Some hint that it'll look a lot more like the UFLPA than anything else. Have you guys been talking about that? What does that look like from your side? And any predictions in terms of either different or similar focus areas from the EU?
Yeah, I mean we're watching that law, the German law that's been in effect,
Hmm.
Canada, France's law, which predates UFLPA. They differ in some ways. Some are more mandating supply chain mapping and traceability of supply chains. Right now, our focus has been driven by what our clients are asking for, which has been UFLPA. We're getting more interest from our clients in Europe, or that those that are concerned about the European regulations, which are obviously some ways away at this point from taking effect. But China is very difficult to get information out of. Um, it's not really possible anymore to do supplier audits like you can in other countries to interview workers and a lot of the standard auditing practices that existed and the questionnaires and whatnot for a number of reasons just aren't really working in China anymore. And so it's not a coincidence that we've seen those investigations that were launched by the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise last year into about a dozen companies, even though Canada's law is global, and it wasn't exactly part of that law, but generally speaking, their focus was global. All those allegations and all the focus was Xinjiang. And that seems to be the focus for NGOs, for the media, for activist groups, for governments. And so for those that are only concerned about the UFLPA, we are that data provider. For those global laws, we are the China part of your program, which is still where, a firm like Kharon is needed.
Yep, absolutely. Anything to add to that, Leo?
Yeah, just that we are certainly anticipating more or less the same uh, type of law, and in every way we're hoping for and advocating for the law to be more or less enforced the same way, so that at least we know that the same approach to mapping, tracing, verifying with a trusted third party research, like Caron, is the right approach that a multinational could use, no matter where they're selling things. What we don't want is different laws for the same issue in different major markets, which then leads to a sort of a triage of goods of what goes where based on the law. So we're definitely seeing that convergence, that sort of single window for customs compliance. We're building towards it. Our customers that are straddling, both sides of the Atlantic are using Sourcemap the same way to tackle traceability mapping on both issues. Even though the EU law hasn't come into effect, we're certainly uh, hoping, and we have good reason to believe it'll be very, very similar to the UFLPA.
And that's one thing I'll add just based off what Leo said. Maybe think of this. We've seen lawmakers and, appointed officials in the US talk openly about not wanting supply chains to be bifurcated, where it's a clean supply chain for the US and then a dirty
Hmm.
supply chain for the rest of the world or for other parts of North America. And so as these other laws come down, you may see pressure from lawmakers in the US that it be applied, more of a multilateral approach is taken to this issue.
Well
Yep,
said.
perfect. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap here. So thank you both so much for the time and the opportunity. Yeah, this will continue to be a hot topic, I think, well into next year. And pretty soon here, I think we'll have another keynote on the same subject. So see you all back here in a bit.